Hey, what's happening, y'all? Jamixdowns here with Intention Music Tech, and in this tutorial, we're going to be covering the basics of mastering for all you beginners out there who want to start taking a crack at mastering your own tracks, which I believe is actually a great idea if you're currently making a lot of music or if you're planning on making a lot of music in the future. But regardless, it's still good to know about mastering, whatever your plans are with your music. So let's get into the video. But first, before we get into the tutorial, if you need a professional mix and master and want me to mix your music, go to jamixdowns.com or click the link in the description and follow the fast and easy 3-step process. And remember, all of my mixing and mastering services have a 100% money-back guarantee to make sure you're completely satisfied with the final result. So for beginners, it's really important that they know exactly what mastering really is and not what they think it is, which in my experience is very common for people to have the misconception of what mastering can and should do for your music. So let's first start with a quick definition. So mastering is the final stage of the music production process when you take a mix and enhance the sonic characteristics of that mix by using audio effects such as EQ, compression, and limiting to create a clean and polished sound that's optimized for all distribution and streaming platforms, and most importantly, making it sound great on all playback systems. So there's basically two types of mastering, and that's the mastering of EPs, albums, and basically any type of project that has multiple tracks to be evenly leveled or blended together cohesively. And then of course there's the mastering of individual songs and projects, which I'm sure is the reason most of you guys are here. So this specific tutorial is about mastering individual songs. So next we're going to look at the difference between mixing and mastering. Now, if you're watching this tutorial, it's likely that you already know what mixing is and you're already mixing to some degree yourself. So I won't dive deep into what mixing is, but more about what mastering is and what its purpose is in the music production process. So as someone who does both mixing and mastering, it's so important for me to clearly explain the difference between mixing and mastering, because in my experience, everybody that's new to music production, and I mean everybody, has a complete misconception of what can be accomplished in the mastering stage. So I really want to talk about the difference between the two processes and set the record straight on what's possible during the mastering stage. And luckily, it's actually very simple to explain. So the most important distinction to understand between the two is that mastering is not designed to fix mixing problems, but it's designed to fix entire mix problems. Meaning if there are problems in the overall mix that need to be addressed, such as unbalanced EQing, then this is what mastering is used for. So for example, if an entire mix sounds thin and some low end needs to be added to thicken it up, or conversely, it sounds too harsh on the top end and needs to be toned down with an EQ, this is all part of the mastering process and things that mastering needs to address. But let's say the chorus is too loud or the outro guitars are too low and getting drowned out in the mix, then you have to readdress these types of things during the mixing processes that are actually mixing issues and not mastering issues. So when it comes to affecting any type of singular aspect to a mix, like a specific instrument or specific vocals or adjusting levels, mastering is not designed to fix these types of problems. All major problems in a mix need to be addressed at the mixing stage. And this is so important for beginners to understand. So always remember that mastering should not be considered a tool to fix problems in a mix, even though it can to some degree, but it should always be used as a tool to enhance the mix and make sure it sounds great in all playback systems. And you wouldn't believe how many clients over the years ask me if I can fix a problem or fix problems in a mix by mastering it. And the answer is almost always going to be a big fat no, because you always have to remember that a master can only be as good as the mix itself. It's so important that you understand that mastering can't make a bad mix sound good, just like mixing can't make a bad recording sound good. So never leave a bad mix in the hands of the mastering engineer in hopes that it will fix everything. This is a classic garbage in, garbage out scenario to always keep in the back of your mind. So make sure your mix is always as tight as possible and use mastering for what it's intended for, and that's to enhance the mix, make it loud, and make it sound great in all playback systems. So there's 4 reasons why you actually need to have your music mastered if you're serious about releasing your music. So number 1, people listen to music everywhere, and mastering is how we make sure that our music is going to sound great everywhere in all playback systems. Number 2, streaming platforms have standards. So playlisters are looking to make sure the music they play sounds professional. And any professional in the music industry knows if a song isn't mixed and mastered well. So mastering is kind of like a measure of quality control you can always exercise on your music to make sure it sounds professional in the hands of other professionals. And number 3, almost all modern music needs to be at a certain loudness level, and mastering is how we accomplish getting our songs as loud as possible without distorting the signal. And number 4, mastering can fix small mix issues. So like we discussed earlier, there is a repairing aspect to mastering, but it's very acute and should not be depended on to fix major mix problems. So before you get started with mastering, there's 3 essential requirements that you need to know about in order to get the most effective mastering results. So number 1 is that you must make sure your space is acoustically treated to at least a basic level. And what I mean by basic level is some form of acoustic absorption on the walls, like foam or acoustic panels. And you should always have bass traps in all the corners of your room as well. It's the only way to get the accuracy needed to effectively master your music. Now, I'm not completely against mastering in headphones if that's all you have to work with, but I strongly advise against using headphones if you actually have a choice. And of course, this is always a huge debate when it comes to mixing, but for mastering, speakers will almost always get you better results. And that's why all professional mastering engineers master in speakers. They have a wider frequency response, a wider stereo image, a more accurate frequency response, and generally, depending on how your room is set up, you'll get better sonic accuracy mastering in a room rather than having headphones directly on your ears. But that's a topic all on its own. So for now, if you can, try and master in speakers in an acoustically treated space. And if that's not possible, then make sure you have a solid set of reference grade studio headphones to master with. And number 2, always make sure your ears are fresh. And I love this tip because it's so important when it comes to effective mastering. Ear fatigue really comes into play here, and I preach about ear fatigue all the time, and it's just such a huge topic to be covered and educated on. So make sure you check out my blog post. It's called The Importance of Ear Training at intentionmusictech.com and get more up to speed with ear training. But because mastering involves so many acute adjustments, it's imperative that you have fresh ears to give yourself the best chance at making the correct adjustments needed. And fresh ears actually make all the difference in the world in all areas of recording and music production, but it's especially true when it comes to mastering. So make sure your ears are always fresh before you do any mastering, because fatigued ears just won't be able to make the acute sonic adjustments required for effective mastering. And trust me, I really learned this one the hard way, and I've had to redo way more masters than I care to admit with you guys. So number 3 is always use at least one reference track. And this is another thing I talk about a lot, and it comes up again here, simply because it's the easiest and best tool you have at your disposal to make sure your songs are sonically competing with your favorite songs. But more importantly, it gives you a guideline to follow that takes out so much of the guesswork to know if you're even heading in the right direction to get the result that you want. Especially when you're new to mixing and mastering and still aren't experienced enough to know how a polished master should sound. And I'm sure if you've done any research on this, you'll know that even the most experienced engineers always use reference tracks for mixing and mastering. So whatever you do, don't neglect this one because it's so easy to implement and so effective. So now that you have a better understanding of what mastering is and what you need to know before you get started, let's jump into the session and see what tools are used in mastering and how to apply them. Okay, so the name of the song that we're working on in this tutorial is called Remedy, and the artist name is Nanya Spark. Super dope, super talented artist, and this track is out right now. And you can get it on all streaming platforms. So if you like the song, make sure you go check out the rest of her music on all streaming platforms. So before we get into the tutorial, I just want to remind you guys that this is a tutorial for mastering for beginners. So I'm not going to be touching on any complex mastering techniques in this particular tutorial, but I will be making more in-depth tutorials on more advanced mastering techniques for those of you who really want to learn more about mastering. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the 6 effects processors used in mastering. And these are the main processors used in mastering. You can definitely use more, but for the sake of this tutorial, we're just going to cover the main 6. And number 1 is an EQ. Number 2 is a compressor. Number 3 is harmonics and harmonic saturation. Number 4 is using stereo imagery. Number 5 are using limiters. And number 6 are using metering software and metering plugins. So those are the 6 that we're going to cover in this tutorial. So before we get started, I'm just going to pull up a master fader in my session because by default, Pro Tools doesn't do that. And I got to do that here. So there's our master fader. So the first thing I want to talk about is Headroom, and this is very important to mastering, and for a couple of reasons, mainly because it allows you to add your effects to your mastering without it distorting too quickly. And general rule of thumb is to have about -3 dB to work with before it hits 0 dB and starts clipping. So I'm going to show you what I mean here. I'm just going to play the song, and then we're going to watch our output meter and make sure that we have it at a good level before we start mastering.
Devil is a liar. He wanna use you to use me. He wanna tempt and entice me. Wahala, you don't confuse me. Devil is a liar. You wanna scatter my medulla. Call me to sit on a regular.
So we're hovering around -4 right there. For me, that's okay to get started for sure. And then so there's sections of the song that will be a little bit louder, but this is something that you always have to watch while you're mastering is your headroom. So again, a common rule of thumb number is to try and get it to around -3 dB. So if you do get a master and it is too loud and it's already clipping, don't even bother mastering it. You're not going to be able to do it properly, and everything you do is just going to distort the signal. So headroom is very important, one of the most important aspects to mastering before you get started. And if you are too loud, if the signal isn't already limited, you can just turn the volume down and get it to where you want, like I said, around -3 dB. So just pull the volume down if it is too loud, and then start your mastering from there. So before we get into the effects used in mastering, I'm going to bring in a reference track. And this is so important, and I want to bring it in at this stage just to show you guys how valuable it is to have as a tool when you're mastering. So I use a plugin called AB Metric here from Adapter Audio. It's actually a Plugin Alliance plugin, but it's an incredible mastering tool, and you definitely don't need this plugin to do this, but this is what I use, and I'm going to show the demonstration with this plugin. So the song I'm going to use is actually another Naya Sparks song, and it's called Undress, and I love this song, but I know it's done really, really well, and it has a similar vibe and feel to the song that we're going to be working on today. So it's a great reference track to use for this particular song. And that's another thing with reference tracks, is to make sure that you have to know that the song has been done well. Otherwise, you're just shooting yourself in the foot, referencing a song that hasn't been mixed or mastered well. So you want to make sure that the song was done well and it was professionally done, so that you know that you're referencing something of quality. So I'm going to bring in the song, and we're going to use this song throughout the course of this tutorial. I'm going to bring it in and drag and drop, and now we have it there. So the first thing that I do with the reference tracks, because they're already limited and they're a lot louder than the track that we're working on at the moment, because we don't have any limiting on it, when we're referencing it, we want to have it at the same level so we get a better idea of what we're referencing. So first thing I'm going to do is just match the levels here.
Devil is a liar. Ooh, yeah. Let me give it to you harder. Yeah, no, you have confused me. Devil is a liar. Oh.
Okay, so that's pretty close. So now the levels are matched. So when I'm doing any EQing or compressing or adding harmonics, whatever we're doing, it's gonna be more accurate when we're referencing it. So that's the reference track. Now we can get into the processing. So the first thing that we're gonna look at is using an EQ. And it's important to understand signal chain when you're mastering as well. So for example, if you're mixing vocals, I personally like to bring in a EQ first when I'm doing subtractive EQ. So I'm taking out frequencies that aren't going to affect the rest of the effects, such as the compressor and so on. And it's the same thing with mastering. If you're going to be taking out frequencies, it's best to have those at the beginning of the signal so you don't have unwanted frequencies hitting your compressor or your limiter. So for this specific tutorial, I'm not really going to do much subtractive EQ because this is for beginners. We're going to focus on more additive EQ, and then I'm going to show you examples of subtractive EQ, but I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I'm still going to keep the EQ at the beginning of the signal chain. So the first thing that we want to do with EQ is look to see if the first things that usually poke out of the mix is usually the top end or the low end. And generally we want to add a bit of low end, or we want to take out a bit of low end. And then we also want to add top end, or we also want to take out some top end. So things that mastering can do, for example, is if I'm just going to play this song here so we get an example, or so we can hear what we have to work with.
When I see you under it.
Oh, sorry, I still have there we go.
Devil is a liar. He wanna use you to use me. He wanna tempt and entice me. Wahala, you don't confuse me. Devil is a liar. Oh. You wanna scatter my medulla. Call me to sit on a regular. You don't do this thing me now. I lose my mind, I'm losing it too. The doctors done they confirm it too. They say my body done the hot too. They say now you be remedy. The doctors done they confirm it too. They say my body done the hot too. They say now you be my eye. Oh remedy, my remedy.
So it's actually a good starting place, like whenever you're doing any mixing, to mix the part of the song that has the most going on. And it you know, when you think about it, it makes sense to do that, because if you're EQing or you're compressing, whatever you're doing, you want to make sure that you get an idea of how that's affecting the signal when you have the most instrumentation, maybe the most vocals going on all at the same time. So I can actually skip ahead to the chorus here, because we have the bass line and we have the sampled vocals, and there's just more going on during the chorus. And this is a good section to do a lot of the mastering in. So let's play this, and then I'm going to play around. Just for example, say we wanted to boost the kick in this master. I'm going to show you what that, an example of what that would look like.
They say now you be my eye. Oh remedy, my remedy.
So I'm exaggerating it now so you can hear what it's doing. Whenever you're doing any type of mastering, you don't want to boost or cut very much at all. A lot of mastering engineers don't like boosting anything more than 1 dB. You know, so that shows you how serious it is. The most that people stretch to that you'll hear is 3 dB. And that's really pushing it, because it's just so easy to distort the signal and just throw the balance of the mix off. So the mastering is always very acute. But again, you can still do sweeps, find the signal what you want to boost, and then bring it back to taste. And that's what we're going to do here.
They say now you be my eye. Oh remedy, my remedy.
So as you can see, we're boosting it around 55, and that's bringing the bass and the kick out a little bit more. And I'm going to pull that down so we can hear how it sounds.
They say now you be my eye. Oh remedy, my remedy.
so that sounds pretty good. We got the kick popping out. We got the bass a little bit deeper, and it's just made the whole mix a little bit fuller. And a lot of times that's what we're after when we're mastering, is trying to mix it to make everything a little bit fuller, because a lot of times when you're mixing, you just don't have the ability to give it that fullness. And this is where it's really important at the mastering stage. So that's an example of boosting a frequency and trying to bring out certain instrumentation in the mix. And then also conversely, we can, if say the kick was too loud, this is where we would pull it down. So for example,
They say now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like energy.
so that's also what could be done with mastering. And for me personally, I think this song needs to be thickened up. So I'm just going to pull this back up and leave it.
They say now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy.
Okay, so that sounds pretty good. So now let's focus on the top end. So when you're new to mastering, I think it's safer to, when you're using EQ, to use a shelf when you first start out mastering. And it will just save you from getting in a lot of trouble, unless your ears are already trained and you have quite a bit of experience mixing already and are familiar with using EQ a lot. Then you can go in and do more intricate cuts within the mastering process. But when you're first starting out, generate a lot of mixes to be able to compete. They're going to need a little bit of top end. Sometimes, of course, you're going to actually need to take away some top end. But a good place to start is adding a shelf. And a lot of times I'll bring it down to around 2500 hertz, because that is the fundamental frequency of a lot of vocals, and especially female vocals. So let's boost the top end here and just get this mix a little bit brighter.
They say now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like energy.
So I'm going to A-B it so you can see how big of a difference this makes. We've only boosted it 1.65 dB, but in mastering, that's a big adjustment.
They say now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like energy. Energy.
So that's a big difference. So now what we can do is go to our reference track and see how our EQ sounds in comparison to a song that's already mastered well.
They say now you be my eye. Say you are under arrest. When I see you under arrest, Soggy come on afu and my head lately. Good for tonight. When I see you under arrest.
So this is why I'm talking about reference tracks are so important, because as you can see, I boosted it quite a bit with the EQ, but it's still not as bright as this master. So I'm going to want to add a little bit more EQ. And a lot of times what I'll do is actually use multiple EQs, because when you push one EQ too hard, it can just be a little bit harsh. I'm going to try and push this one a little bit more. I'm not going to get into those more advanced techniques in this video. So I'm just going to boost this up just a little bit more.
Soggy come on afu and arrest. Oh, hey, baby, would you just. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like energy. Energy, oh, energy. They say now you be my eye.
Okay, so that sounds good. So that's just an example of using EQ. And of course, these are just basic adjustments for as far as mastering is concerned. It gets a lot more cute. And again, this involves more ear training. So a good safe place to start is with the low end and the top end. And then in the mid range, if you're comfortable in the mid range, you can look to boost and cut in the mid-range as well. But the key is to not do any extreme boosts or cuts. It's very subtle to get the best results with using an EQ in mastering. Okay, so next we are going to look at using a compressor for mastering, and I have this one bypassed. I'm using the Pro C. The reason I had it bypassed is because by default it actually starts out with a lot of heavy compression, so I had to have it bypassed so it wasn't affecting anything we're doing with the EQ. So the most important compressor settings for mastering, of course, are the threshold. They're all important, but we want to make sure that the ratio isn't too high. So for me, when I'm mastering, I try and keep it between 2.1 and 4.1 tops, but usually, a 2-to-1 ratio is good. We don't want it too heavy because we get a lot of that when we do the limiting later on in the mastering phase. And then the attack, release, and knee are very important settings when it comes to compression with mastering. So whenever we're using compression with mastering, we're looking at, there's two terms that we use, and one is punch. We generally want something punchy depending on the track, or we want it more glued together. And these are the terms that are used a lot in audio. And essentially what glue is a thicker, fuller sound that's a little bit smoother. And then punchy is just exactly how it sounds. And usually that is more involved with the kick and the snare and getting the drums popping out of the mix the best we can. And the way we go about doing that is by adjusting our attack, release, and knee settings. But first, the most important thing is adjusting the threshold. So when we're compressing and mastering, we want to make sure that we don't have a lot of gain reduction. For me personally, I don't like going past 2 dB of gain reduction with compression. Otherwise, it's just going to flatten and squash the mix, unless that's what you're after. And a lot of times tracks call for that, and that's what people want, and that's fine. But generally for me, I like to actually keep the gain reduction around 1 dB. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do here. I'm just going to back up on the attack and release, and then we're going to set the threshold and try and just get 1 dB or so of gain reduction.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like Hennessy.
So as you can see, like just on the graph here, we're just tickling with that compression because we want to keep those transients intact and still have some sort of transient response. That's the key when we're using compression, if that's what you're after. But good mastering compression is keeping the transient response there, but still having a nice glued together mix. So now that we have our gain reduction set there, I'm going to talk about how gluing the mix works, and then how getting a punchy mix works. So the settings for gluing a mix together is actually we want more of a faster attack, and then we want a slower release. So when those transients are hitting the compressor, it's hitting right away, and then it's a slower release, and it gives just more of a smoothing sound to the master. And we have to be careful with our attack and release. You generally don't want anything slower than 50 milliseconds. Otherwise, it's going to start distorting the signal. And it's the same thing with the release. We don't want too slow of a release. Otherwise, it will distort the signal as well. So that's something important to keep in mind when using compression and limiting when mastering. We don't want anything too fast. So let's play this and let's dial in more of a glued setting for this track.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like Hennessy. Hennessy, oh Hennessy.
So I'm going to A-B it. Hopefully you guys can hear it, because a lot of this stuff is very subtle, but it just thickened it out and smoothed it out a little bit more. So I'm going to play it one more time.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy.
So that sounds good to me. We still have, it's still punchy. I still want it punchy, but I want more of a smooth sounding master for this particular song. And if we wanted punch, what we would do is have a slower attack time so that the transients can pop through the mix. And then we also want to keep the release somewhat slow, but more mid-range for a punchy mix, because we don't want it to stick too long when we're after a certain kind of a punchy effect. We want to have more of a mid-range release time. So just so you hear how it sounds, I'll just give you a sample.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like Hennessy. They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately.
So it's very subtle, but those transients are popping through, and the kick and the percussion are popping out of the mix a little bit more. But I'm going to go back to the setting that I had it on before, because I want it a little more glued together. Now, the last thing we're going to look at is the knee, and this is very important. So with a soft knee, and this would be considered a soft knee, as you can see, it just kind of straightens out. This is what we're after for more of a glued together mix, and I'm going to show you how it sounds and how much of a difference it can make to have to adjust the knee settings. So I'm going to put it back to 0, and then I'm going to adjust it in the mix.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately.
So as you can see, it's starting to squash the mix a little bit more when we have that softer knee. And then if you want more of an aggressive compression sound, then you want more of a hard knee. And I'm going to show you what that sounds as well. So it sounds like as well.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like Hennessy.
So as you can see, there's a big difference between a hard knee and a soft knee, and that's why this setting is so important to understand with mastering. So for this song in particular, I don't like how it sounds too soft. That's too squashed for me. I'm going to go for more of a hard effect.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy.
So now I'm going to A-B it. Well, I'm going to A-B the compressor.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like Hennessy.
So for me, this just sounds like a good mix. It's glued together in a good way, but then it also has some punch and aggression because of how I've adjusted the knee. So for me, it's just a good blend of both. And these are the basics that you have to understand when it comes to using compression with mastering. So next thing we're going to look at is using harmonics on the master track. And harmonics are a really unusual effect to use because they can do so much, not just for mastering, just in all aspects of audio. And one thing I do want to point out, when you do add harmonic distortion to a signal, it actually does add some soft knee compression to the signal as well. So depending on what plugins you're using, it can actually glue, it has a way of gluing the mix together just by adding harmonics. And sometimes you might not even need to use a compressor if you're depending on the plugin and the type of saturation and harmonics that you're using. So I just wanted to quickly point that out. So in a lot of ways, I actually prefer to use harmonics and harmonic exciters over using an EQ when it comes to boosting the signal. So if I'm adding top end or low end, a lot of times I'll go to a harmonic exciter to accomplish this. And for a lot of reasons, for one, just by nature, harmonic exciters make the fundamental frequencies easier to hear. They're also louder. It makes the fundamental frequencies louder, and then it also gives it effect to be an effect to be perceived as being wider to the ear, and then it also just gives a fuller sound. And you'll see what I mean here. So this is a plugin that I like using. It's called the Oven. It's actually one of the most incredible plugins. I'll keep saying this in all my tutorials. If to anybody out there, this is my go-to plugin right now. Great for mastering, great on vocals, great for everything. But you definitely don't need to use this plugin. Any harmonic exciter will work. So what I'm going to do is just dial in some settings here, just so you can see the power of what harmonics can do in mastering.
They say now you be my eye, or remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately, high on you like Hennessy. Hennessy, oh Hennessy. They say now you be my eye, or remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately, high on you like Hennessy. Hennessy, oh Hennessy.
Okay, so I've just dialed in some quick settings here, but I'm going to A/B it so you can see how powerful this is.
They say now you be my eye, or remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately, high on you like Hennessy. Hennessy, oh Hennessy.
So as you can see, it's just a really powerful tool when it comes to mastering. The whole song is just bigger, and I've added depth to it with the low end here, and I've brightened it up with the top end sizzle, and it's just given that effect where everything is bigger, it's wider, and that's what harmonics do. And this is why it's such an important tool when it comes to mastering. And harmonics, that's a whole topic on its own to discuss, but I just wanted to show you guys why this is such a utilized tool in mastering. So the fourth effect processor that we're going to look at is using a stereo imager. And I just want to point out that when you are mastering, or if you are planning on getting into mastering, if you can get plugins that have multi-band capabilities, it makes a huge difference when you're mastering. So for example, this is a stereo width imager from Ozone. And what it does, it allows me to adjust different frequency spectrums within the mix. But I'm not going to do that in this tutorial. Again, that's for more advanced techniques. But I just wanted to put that out there. So there's multi-band compressors, multi-band harmonics, multi-band imagers, multi-band everything, because it's just more effective, and you can get more detailed when it comes to mastering. But for this specific tutorial, we're just going to stick with I actually really like this plugin. It's a free plugin, and I use it quite a bit, and it works well for any type of mastering or mixing. So basically what we're trying to do here with stereo imaging is just get a wider mix, but you have to be careful when using these plugins on mastering, because if you widen it too much, it will actually flatten the sound. So you need to find a balance, something that works, or it's not too much, but it's still giving you that bigger sound, but you definitely don't want to overdo it. So I'm just gonna play around with this. I'm going to exaggerate it, and then you can hear what it's doing to the signal, and I'm going to A/B it.
They say now you be my eye, or remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately, high on you like Hennessy.
So depending on what playback system you're listening to this in, it just makes a huge difference when you spread out the stereo feel like that in mastering. So now what I'm going to do is just pull it back to taste and just give it a little bit of width to make the song sound a little bit bigger.
They say now you be my eye.
And this is also a great time to use the reference track as well. So I'm going to pull up this reference track while I'm dialing in the stereo width.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately.
So even though I've done only 4% here, you can actually hear how big of a difference it makes on the track.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. When I see you under this, oh, hey, baby, would you just caress? Got me feeling good tonight. They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy.
So you can see it's starting to sound really nice. It's actually a little bit fuller than the undressed track. It sounds like I didn't do any stereo width on the undressed mix, and I definitely didn't have this oven plugin. But when we reference it, we can see that we're on track to it sounding good. So I'm going to play this one more time and A/B it.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, hey, baby, would you just caress? Got me feeling good.
And now, because we've added all this stuff, the level on the original track that the mastering has gone up. So we're going to match the level with our reference track. That's very important.
Tonight will be my eye. You come on now for under this. Oh, hey, baby, would you just caress? Come on now for under this. Oh, hey, baby, would you just caress? Got me feeling good. Medi, you did my head lately.
So that's sounding really good. And I hope you can see the power of using these reference tracks, because we just have something to see. We have a template to go by instead of just doing the guesswork and hoping that everything sounds good. So now we can see that we're on track and it sounds really good so far. So I'm going to actually just bypass everything that we've done up to this point so you can see how everything is sounding so far. So let's try this out.
Oh, hey, baby, would you just my eye? Got me feeling good. Oh, remedy, my remedy.
Let me try that again.
They said now you'll be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like Hennessy. Hennessy, oh, Hennessy.
Okay, so it's starting to sound really, really good. And these are just 4 processes. That's all we've done so far, and you can see how powerful it already is. So that's using stereo imagery. We don't want to overdo stereo imagery, and a lot of times, to be honest, I don't use it on all of my masters. It just kind of depends if I feel the track needs it or not. But it can make a really big difference in the overall master. So next, we're gonna look at using a limiter. And a limiter is one of the most important elements to mastering, because it's the tool we use to help us get the most level out of our track without the signal distorting. Now, the difference between a compressor and a limiter is that a compressor compresses the transients and the peaks, and a limiter cuts them right off. And because it cuts them off, this is how we're able to get more level out of our track. One thing that's important to note when you are mastering and using limiters, limiters should always be the last effect in your signal chain. So as you can see, I have these other effects here, but I have the maxim last. I have this other limiter here that I want to show you guys something a little bit later on, but I'm going to bypass it for now. But the limiter always has to be the last effect in the signal chain for this to work properly, because you're dealing with the last output stage. And if you add anything after it, it's most likely going to distort the signal very quickly. So I'm going to start out by using this maxim limiter. This is the stock Pro Tools limiter. And these are just basic settings that are on most limiters. So we have the threshold, we have the ceiling, and we have a release. A lot of limiters don't have an attack setting, but though most of them will all have a release setting. And then we have our attenuation here, which is essentially our gain reduction. And these other settings here, because of the scope of this tutorial, I'm not going to get into dither and noise shaping. We're just going to focus on the threshold, ceiling, release, and gain reduction. So we have our threshold, and then we have our ceiling, and the ceiling is very important. And what we want to do is take this off of 0 and just have it at either negative 0.1 or negative 0.2. So our transients can't go past 0 dB. And I'm going to show you why this is important. So first thing we're going to do is pull the threshold down and start getting the level back out of our mix. And while I'm doing this, we're listening for distortion and we're watching our gain reduction, because the more gain reduction we have, the more we're going to flatten our sound. And this, of course, is something that we have to be very careful of when we are doing limiting. So a lot of it is ears, making sure we're not distorting. And then a lot of it too is still watching our gain reduction and make sure we're not pushing the threshold too hard.
They said now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy.
So whenever I'm doing any mastering, I try and stay away from doing any type of gain reduction or attenuation past 6 dB. So we're going to try and stay in that range, and hopefully we can still get the level we want out of our track.
They said now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately.
So I'm going to A/B this so you can see how much louder it's got from me pulling this threshold down.
They said now you be my eye.
So that sounds great. So now we're going to look at the release time. So release time is important because the longer the release, the more flattened the sound is going to be, because the limiter is holding longer. So a quicker release is going to have more of a punchy sound, and then a longer release is going to have more of a gluing and heavily compressed sound. So if you want to maintain your transients, if you like the way that your mix is sounding at the present points, then you want to keep your release time somewhat neutral. I would say between 50 and 100 milliseconds.
They said now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like Hennessy. They said now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy.
And one thing I want to quickly mention about using a limiter on the master is the release time. Generally, if you have a release time that's too fast, say 50 milliseconds or faster, there's a very good chance that it's going to distort the signal. It's kind of the same thing as using a compressor. So stay away from release times, anything faster than 50 milliseconds. It's very important that you understand that tip, because it's just a way that you can be compressing the signal and not realizing what's doing it. Okay, so now this is where using the reference tracks comes in, and also an LUFS meter. And that's why I wanted to actually just quickly bring in this limiter here to show you that it can be really handy to use a limiter that has a built-in LUFS meter. And a lot of new, especially mastering limiters, but just any limiters will have an LUFS meter. And this is the number that we're going for to judge our levels. So for streaming, we want our levels to be somewhere around between 8 and 9 LUFS to be competitive as far as getting your songs as loud as the competition. And of course, this varies from genre to genre, but if you're doing any type of music associated in the pop genre, you want to get your stuff as loud as possible. And what we're aiming for is somewhere between 8 and 9 LUFS. And I'm just going to play this here quickly just so you can see what I'm talking about.
They said now you be my eye. Oh, remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately.
So I have that at negative 8.4. So I know generally that's going to be a very competitive level when it comes to mastering. And we're going to look more at the LUFS metering in when we start looking at all of the metering involved in mastering. But for now, I'm going to bypass this. And this essentially is what limiting is all about. When you first start mastering, you want to make sure your ceiling is set to negative 0.1. So none of the transients can pop through that level. And then also we have our threshold, and this is how we bring up our level. And then we have our release time, which is going to judge how punchy the mastering is. And then our attenuation is our gain reduction. So we're watching how much of the signal that we're limiting. So these are the basics of limiting when it comes to mastering. Okay, so now we're going to get to the final stage of the mastering process, and we're going to be using metering plugins. Now, and also we're going to be using reference tracks. This is really where the reference track comes in to be the most valuable at this stage of the process to make sure that we're on track without doing the guesswork. So I like this plugin from Adapter Audio, this AB metric. It's actually a plugin alliance plugin, but you can literally do everything. You can AB your track, and then it has all of the metering here. And it's just a very good plugin to use for mastering. But of course, a lot of you aren't going to have this plugin. And there is a free plugin out there that I just quickly want to mention. And it's this plugin from Ulean, and it's the loudness meter. And this is a free version. And this is going to give you access to basic metering for mastering, because a lot of you that are just starting out, you're not going to have metering plugins. And this is a great one. And if you want to upgrade to the full version, which is going to give you a lot of similar functionality as the Adapter Audio plugin, it even has an AB function here. It's only, I believe, $41 Canadian. So it's very affordable if you want or need to use a metering plugin. So I'm going to go back to Adapter Audio. And the first thing we're going to do is start referencing this mix to make sure that the loudness and just everything, the EQ, make sure it's well balanced, all the things we want to look for to make sure it's going to sound good on all playback systems. And that's why having the reference track that we already know sounds good on all playback systems is so important to have here. So let's play it, and let's AB it with the reference.
They said now you be my eye. Come on now for oh, hey, baby, would you just get it?
So earlier I had turned the level down on the reference track so we can match levels. And now that I have the limiter on there, the levels are up. So we have to bring this reference track back to 0 where it should be. And we're going to try and level match with it at 0 dB.
I'll be feeling all good tonight. Do you know you're a fighter? My people, they call you dirty. Come over me. When I see you under the side, high on you like Hennessy. Feeling good all tonight. When I see you under the side, they said now you be my eye. Alright.
So that actually sounds very close to me. A lot of this, we're just using our ears. And then, of course, you can go to the metering and make sure that your LUFS levels are right. So here again, these are LUFS levels. And what we're looking for is an integrated LUFS. And this works by playing the whole song. And if the whole song is at a certain level, then we know that we're competitive. And of course, I don't have time to do that in this tutorial, but that's what you're after with the integrated LUFS. This is the most important one that you need to look at in order to make sure that your sound is going to be competitive. And if your sound is matching the reference track without it being distorted, then you know that you're in the right direction and it should sound good in all playback systems. So that's why referencing is so important. Next, so this particular plugin has all the metering. It has a spectrum analyzer. It has a spectrum analyzer so you can see how balanced your mix is looking from a frequency standpoint.
They say now you be my oh remedy, my remedy.
It also has a correlation meter, and this is, of course, more advanced, but this is to check to make sure that your mix is in phase. And then it has a stereo image meter to make sure that your imagery is balanced as well.
They say now you be my oh remedy, my remedy.
And then here this is going to show you your dynamic range. And this essentially is going to show you if your mix is, or sorry, your master is too squashed or not, or too flat. And we want to, this is how we kind of judge to see if we're maintaining some sort of reasonable dynamics in our master.
They say now you be my oh remedy, my remedy.
And then of course we have our loudness meters here. And again, for the scope of this video, I'm not going to go deep into this stuff. I'm going to be putting on other videos on mastering where I'll go over more of this stuff in detail. But these are the basic meters that are involved with mastering. And then as you start getting more involved with mastering, you start understanding how to do this stuff more. But this is how you make sure that your stuff is going to sound good on all playback systems and that you're meeting the standards of the streaming platforms. And if you are distributing it, you know, on CD or vinyl or whatever it might be, all of the stuff you need to make sure that everything is on point is through plugins like this. So before I wrap up here, I just want to A/B what we've done on the master so you can see how powerful mastering is. So I'm going to get rid of this plugin because we're not using it, and also this plugin. And I'm going to A/B it for you guys.
They say now you be my oh remedy, my remedy. You did my head lately. High on you like Hennessy. Hennessy.
So it's not level matched, but you can see because it's louder, we're going to perceive it to sound better. And there are ways to do level matching with the metering plugins. But again, what we're after here is enhancing the sonic characteristics of the mix. As you can see, I didn't do anything too drastic with mastering. They were just all little incremental things that added up to the full master. And that's so important to understand when you're mastering, is incremental, small incremental changes are going to get you the best results in mastering. So these are the basics when it comes to mastering using these 6 effects processors. I hope that you guys were able to just get some sort of rough idea on where to start when it comes to mastering. And again, I'm going to start rolling out more mastering videos for those of you that want to start getting more involved with mastering, because it does go a lot deeper than this. But with these fundamentals, it's definitely a good start with mastering. Hey, so if you're enjoying this content and you're really serious about learning how to mix and you're really looking to take your mixing game to the next level, make sure you check out my brand new recording academy at attentionmusictech.com, because for a limited time, I'm offering free access to my first 2 courses. They're a part of my new Mixing Clinic series of mini courses that are a real comprehensive dive into mixing lead vocals and mixing beats. So when you sign up to the academy, you'll get access to both the Pro Lead Vocal Mixing Clinic and the Savage Beats Mixing Clinic. And these 2 courses are packed with some of my favorite mixing tips and techniques that I use on all my tracks and work for any genre of music. And I know are guaranteed to help you get more professional sounding mixes, because we're talking over 2 hours of mixing tips that aren't accessible anywhere else but in the academy. So you really don't want to miss out on this opportunity. All you got to do is go to attentionmusictech.com to sign up. And again, this is all free stuff, but only for a limited time. And when you do sign up, you don't only get access to the 2 mini courses, but you get special offers and content only subscribers see. And also you get automatically entered to win one of our free monthly giveaways of industry leading plugins from FabFilter and Plugin Alliance. And if this promo is over by the time you guys see this video, don't worry about it, because I always have great offers going on for all my academy members. So go to attentionmusictech.com and check out all the goodies I got going on for you guys. So mastering is definitely one of those skills that takes a lot of practice and a lot of study to be able to finally start getting it right. But it's such a great skill to have in the toolbox, and in my opinion, it's definitely worth the time to learn if you're making or working on a lot of music. So like always, I hope this information was helpful to you guys in some way, shape, or form, and I'll see y'all next week in the next video.